Well, U.S. President Donald Trump's increased tariffs on steel and aluminum are now in effect. The levies now sit at 50%.
When Donald Trump strutted into a press conference last month and announced a new round of sweeping tariffs, he delivered it with that signature bravado, chest puffed, arms wide, and promises of bringing America's manufacturing dominance back from the dead. This time, he wasn't just targeting China. He aimed directly at Canada, slapping a bold 50% tariff on steel and aluminum imports, claiming it was a matter of national security and economic independence. For a moment, his base cheered. Conservative commentators hailed it as a genius move, a masterstroke in protecting American jobs. But behind the scenes, things began to unravel fast. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now back to the video.
It's basically generally saying, they could handle the 25% tariffs. It would be difficult. They would take certainly a haircut on their revenues and the total amount that they're exporting to the U.S. A lot of concern about this, particularly from the steel and aluminum industries, as well as their labor unions, all of them raising concerns about what this is going to mean for exporters of metals to the United States.
The tariff announcement didn't just spark outrage from trade experts and economists. It ignited legal panic within Trump's own circle. Almost immediately, lawsuits were filed. The courts weren't buying the emergency powers justification. Within days, a federal court issued a temporary block, ruling that Trump had grossly overstepped his authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The judge's ruling was clear. National security cannot be used as a convenient excuse to bypass Congress and impose economic restrictions on allies. This legal blow came just as markets began reacting to the instability. Wall Street dipped and American manufacturers started issuing warnings. Auto companies, especially those relying on cross-border supply chains with Canada, sounded the alarm. Plants in Michigan and Ohio reported delays in sourcing materials, while pricing estimates on construction steel soared overnight. What was supposed to be a patriotic economic weapon was quickly becoming a domestic liability. And then came the response from Canada. Prime Minister Mark Carney, a man known more for fiscal policy than political theater, stepped up to a podium in Ottawa and delivered what many are calling the most pointed rebuttal of his political career. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't mirror Trump's bombast. He didn't have to. With calm authority, he called the tariffs unlawful, unjustified, and economically self-defeating. Carney went on to remind the world that Canada had stood by the U.S. during multiple international crises and wars, and that this economic aggression from a supposed ally was not only a breach of trade agreements, but a slap in the face. Our steel has built your bridges, your skyscrapers, and your vehicles, he said. It has never been a threat to your security, only a partner in your prosperity. That speech instantly went viral, but what followed was even more consequential. Carney didn't just respond rhetorically, he acted. He announced a sweeping acceleration of infrastructure development across Canada. Billions would be invested into domestic industries, ports, and energy pipelines. More importantly, Carney unveiled a long-planned but quietly held strategy, reducing Canadian reliance on American trade. He declared that Canada would now pivot toward increased trade with Europe and Asia, leveraging its existing agreements like CETA and CPTPP. Incentives would be offered to manufacturers willing to reconfigure supply chains away from the United States. The message was loud and clear. If Trump wanted a trade war, Canada was ready and willing to walk away from the table altogether. The international community took notice. Leaders in Germany, Japan, and even the UK issued thinly veiled criticisms of Trump's strategy, noting that such unilateral actions eroded trust in the global economic system. Meanwhile, back in Washington, even some Republicans privately expressed concern over the blowback. Several GOP senators, particularly those in agriculture-heavy states, began pushing for emergency exemptions and trade relief funds. Trump, however, remained defiant. Publicly, he tweeted that Carney was weak and trying to look tough for the cameras. But those inside Trump's inner circle said he was furious. According to leaked memos from the Department of Commerce, there was no backup plan. Trump had assumed Canada would fold, just as he assumed Mexico would pay for the wall. Instead, he had backed the U.S. into a corner, both diplomatically and economically. Farmers began feeling the sting next. Canadian counter tariffs on U.S. agricultural exports kicked in swiftly. Soybean and corn producers in the Midwest saw orders canceled. Dairy and poultry exports were delayed or outright rejected at Canadian ports. One Iowa farmer said bluntly in an interview, "We've become pawns in a war nobody wanted." What made things worse was Trump's insistence that everything was under control. In a town hall event, he claimed the U.S. was winning the trade war and accused the media of spreading Canadian propaganda. But voters weren't buying it. Polling data showed a sharp drop in support among working-class white voters in swing states. Those very voters Trump once said he would never abandon. Meanwhile, Carney's approval rating in Canada soared. He was hailed not just for his economic response, but for his composure. Editorials from Toronto to Berlin praised him for drawing a red line without resorting to political theatrics. Some even speculated that this moment had solidified Carney's legacy, not just as a prime minister, but as a statesman capable of standing up to American exceptionalism when it turned reckless. The contrast between the two leaders became a story of its own. Where Trump had leaned into chaos, Carney leaned into planning. Where Trump dismissed facts and data, Carney released detailed economic reports. And while Trump mocked Carney's calm tone, voters across North America began noticing who was actually delivering results. As more court hearings unfolded, legal analysts pointed out a recurring theme in Trump's defense: the insistence that the president has unlimited authority in matters of economic policy. That argument wasn't just flawed, it was dangerous. If upheld, it would allow any future president to sidestep Congress entirely and rewrite trade policy on a whim. Thankfully for the checks and balances of the U.S. system, the courts were having none of it. Trump's legal team tried to argue that the tariffs were a short-term measure and would lead to long-term gains. But data was already showing the opposite. Imports were down, jobs were being affected, and global partners were slowly rerouting their business elsewhere. American companies that once relied on Canadian steel were now exploring alternatives in Brazil and South Korea, places with different logistical nightmares and higher costs. One of the most unexpected consequences came from the automotive sector. U.S. carmakers, already struggling with inflation and chip shortages, now faced steep price hikes on basic raw materials. Executives from Ford and GM reportedly met with administration officials urging a rollback or, at the very least, a pause on enforcement. But Trump refused. He was betting everything on a tough guy image, believing that the optics of being hard on trade would outweigh the real-world consequences. But that bluff has finally exploded. With Canada refusing to yield, the courts undermining the legal foundation, and industries turning against the policy, Trump's strategy lay in tatters. Allies he once took for granted were now building bridges elsewhere. Economies he hoped to isolate were becoming more interconnected than ever, just without the United States in the picture. At a recent event, Carney was asked whether he thought Trump would reverse course. He smiled faintly and replied, "That's a question for the American people. But here in Canada, we know what it means to play the long game." That quote made headlines too, because at its heart, this entire episode wasn't just about tariffs or trade, it was about leadership, about which kind of strength actually builds nations, and which kind merely shouts into a microphone hoping the world listens. In the end, Trump's bluff didn't just fail, it exposed the fragility of his economic vision and the danger of using foreign policy as a performance. And as countries like Canada forge ahead with new alliances and new trade routes, America is left with an uncomfortable question. Was it all worth it? For Trump, that answer may not come in a courtroom or at a press conference, but at the ballot box, where voters will have to decide whether they still believe in the man who promised to make America great again by making enemies out of friends.